All right, what were we talking about 2 weeks ago?
Grail.
And what about the Grail? All right. Well, what we were going to do is I was going to have Sam show the part out of the movie where the final stages of the quest for the Grail, where Percival is out wandering the wasteland. And then he finally, when he has a near-death experience, he finds the Grail, returns to Camelot with it, gives King Arthur a drink. King Arthur is revived. He rounds up the knights. They ride forth, and as they're riding forth, the whole kingdom is coming back to life. And that's one of the central motifs of the whole Grail story, is this, the enchantment of Britain, or the destruction of there's several versions of it, but in the Arthurian tales, they place the death of Arthur, according to most Grail scholars, it's somewhere between 536 and 540 A.D. There's been a couple of authors, and I brought one book, in fact I brought a couple of books, that deal, this one is by a fellow named David Keyes, it's called Catastrophe. And essentially what it's about is that it was a catastrophe without precedent in recorded history. For months on end, starting in AD 535, a strange dusky haze robbed much of the earth of normal sunlight. So this guy here is he's an archaeologist, I believe, and he goes into exploring all of the evidence that there was some kind of a very bizarre climate anomaly that played itself out roughly from 535 or 536 AD up to maybe about 542 or 543. Number of years later, in fact I was going to bring it in, I forgot to bring it in, another book by Mark Baillie, who is a dendrochonologist, looked at the same period, came to it independently of this guy, and he did it because he was studying tree rings, and he discovered that around 536 to 540 AD, right in there, for the most part, forest growth in the British Islands came to a halt. And he was wondering why and how widespread it was. So he began investigating evidence for some kind of a climate event or climate change that would have occurred at that time beyond the boundaries of the British Isles. And as he began to look, he found that the signal was preserved various ways all over the planet. And came to the conclusion that there was something that happened. Okay? This guy concludes, without a lot of solid evidence, mostly circumstantial, that what happened was there was a great volcanic eruption, or a series of volcanic eruptions, probably in the area of Sumatra, and it caused for somewhere between 5 to 10 years while this series of eruptions was going on, it blanketed the planet in a veil of volcanic dust. Mark Baillie, on the other hand, reads the evidence that it's consistent with dust, but he concludes the dust is of a cosmic source. And he goes into a lot of tales, and particularly into the Grail mythology, to show that it is consistent with the idea of Earth encountering at least once, maybe several times, a comet. And but in either case, they both come to the conclusion from independently studying evidence that there was something that occurred, and then referring to the literature and discovering that the whole Grail mythos, which appeared in the 1100s and 1200s, we've talked about that time frame in which the Grail stories appeared. About 10 separate or a dozen separate Grail accounts emerged like within a 50-year period in the late 1100s and early 1200s. We discussed how it's highly likely that the source of these Grail stories were the Templar Knights, and it may have even been part of a concerted, well, let's say an agreed upon declassification of previously classified knowledge. And in any case, we've looked at a few of the quotes. I've extracted some more, and I have some very interesting quotes out of some of the Grail stories. We looked at the one that one of the most interesting is by this Wolfram von Eschenbach, where he describes the Grail as Lapis Exillis. And who remembers the translation of that?
Blue stone.
What?
Blue stone?
No,
Stone.
stone, the stone that falls from heaven. or the stone that fell from heaven, Lapis Exillis. And he shows that there's a play on words, that it can have several meanings, but variously it refers to the idea of a stone. And Wolfram explicitly connects the idea of a grail with a stone, whereas other authors like Chrétien de Troyes, if I can say it correctly, he surmised, he was the one who, and Robert de Boron also picked up on the idea that it was the cup used at the Last Supper. And of course, a lot of the Grail scholars, trying to make sense out of all of the many diverse interpretations and descriptions of the Grail, have been very confused. And then I presented the idea that what we're seeing is that in this deliberate declassification of this esoteric tradition regarding the Grail, various individuals were given responsibility for certain portions of the system, if you want to call it a system, which is what it was, I think, a type of a system of knowledge. And I use the analogy of any machine. I use the analogy of an automobile. It's made up of distinct components, but depending upon which component, you could describe a carburetor and you could describe 4 rubber tires, and it's going to sound like you're describing 2 entirely different things. But it's only when you put together all of the systems and all of the components that you have a machine that will then now transport you from point A to point B. And to me, I see the Grail literature as being very similar to the disclosures about alchemy. We find the same thing, the same types of effects at work in like the 15th and 16th century alchemical literature. It has been known by those who've studied extensively and deeply into the alchemical literature that different authors reveal different parts of the great work. No one author reveals the whole procedure from start to finish. No one author reveals all of the separate materials that have to go into it. In order to decipher that, you have to go to multiple authors, take all of their hints and clues and pieces and put it all together and figure out how the whole system works. Well, it's the same way with the Grail literature. Each one is giving a description of a part of the whole machine, and I use the idea of a machine because once the pieces are put together, then it can begin to function. So Wolfram describes it as stone that falls from heaven, and others describe it as the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper. Well, what on earth could be the connection between the stone that falls from heaven and the cup that was used at the Last Supper? And then again, what was that cup subsequently used for after the Last Supper? What happened? Into whose care did the cup fall?
Also, it's about catching the blood. That factor too.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I'm asking. What happened subsequent to? Good. Yeah, Joseph of Arimathea. And who was Joseph of Arimathea? What?
What do you suppose they did with the blood?
Well, that's the question. What did they do with the blood? What was he doing there exactly?
Okay. Another thing is, how did the word like a crater and such as this? How did that get into the Grail literature?
Well, maybe we just better pull it up here.
Did you see where that ark fell down this week? It was in the newspaper.
What was that again? Yeah, there were.
One of those arches out west.
Oh, out west, yes. And the thing that I thought, it's interesting, not to digress, I did actually have a thought about that. When you said the arch, the stone arch, the sandstone arch, right, that was out in arches. One of them collapsed. And of course, what that just reminded me of is the fact that I already knew that those arches are all in the process of being destroyed. They're not being created, they're being destroyed. The processes that created those arches no longer are operational. So they're now being destroyed. So, but that gets us back to, events that have transpired and how we can read the landscape around us and understand that most of what we see in the landscape around us was the end result of forces unlike those that we have experienced in modern history. And those arches is, how many arches have we been to now? We went to an arch. That was the first thing we did on our trip, was we went to an arch, right? And we talked about the origin of those arches. And I think you, at that point, hopefully, if you remember, what I was trying to convey was the idea that the forces of nature that created that arch are not working now. The forces that are working on it now will destroy that arch in another 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 years. So why do you think we went to see that arch? You know, you just forgotten, but it's in there. Because what would have been the force of nature that created that arch? Think of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Water, exactly. But not water like was flowing in that vicinity now, right? Not at all that kind of water. The kind of water that Derrida dropped by an interesting magazine at my house earlier in the week about an event called Blue Ridge Country, right? Anybody ever seen it? Very nice little magazine devoted to mainly tourism in the Blue Ridge, but it had an article. It was in 1995, and it had an article about the event that happened in Nelson County, Virginia in 1969. Who knows what happened in Nelson County, Virginia in 1969? In the summer. It was August of 1969.
The Hatfield
No.
That was in the 40s.
What happened was Hurricane Camille came up out of the Gulf of Mexico. It was a huge, very powerful hurricane, Class 5 hurricane. Came up, passed over the southeast, and it stalled over this small, like 3 or 4 county area of Virginia. And the center of it was right over Nelson County. And in 24 hours, it dumped about 40-some inches of rain on one county. And the hydrologist that studied it said, well, this is probably, we don't even know, because floods like this happen so rarely on this scale that it's got to be like a minimum of a once in 10,000 year flood. There was so much water dumped on Nelson County. Well, the interesting thing about it is, and I haven't really shared any of this information with you about the flooding outside of the Channel Scablands, but however, what was interesting about that 1969 event was that what we see is the energies, and they estimate the energy released over those 3 or 4 counties by Hurricane Camille during that 24 or 36 hour period that it was stalled was equivalent to 40,000 megatons. 40,000 megatons, which is 4 times more energy than was in the global nuclear arsenal at its peak in the early 60s. And that gives us a little bit of, you know, and ordinarily storms can marshal tremendous amounts of energy, but they're usually dispersed. This happened to, for whatever this unique confluence of atmospheric and meteorological conditions that caused the storm to stop right over this area. Well, the point of all of this is simply that what they begin to observe in terms of geomorphic consequences was approaching, but not matching, the evidence for ancient water flows all over the southern Appalachians. Many of you, which have seen the slides that I've shown, that I've brought in regarding that, and of course, essentially, it took 10 years for the county to recover from that, or longer. And this little freak event, the important thing here is that the freak event, this anomalous event, is actually what we learn from, just like Tunguska teaches us. That's a cosmic teaching moment. And we look at Tunguska and we can learn in this little micro event, we can look at what happened in Nelson County, Virginia, and only by seeing the phenomena that was a consequence of that can we then look and see what's preserved in the landscape from former times.
You know, Randall, I remember 10 years ago in class you were telling us that you know, some of the figures that they ran about Camille was that it approached the theoretical maximum of how much rain could possibly fall from a particular section of sky under ideal conditions.
Yes, in fact, some of the survivors said that the rainfall coming down was so heavy you couldn't even breathe. It was like being underwater.
Wow.
Yeah.
What county?
This was Nelson County. If you're out hiking and you see something like that,
On top of it, there's a rock.
yeah, if you see something like that on top, Yeah, exactly.
You want to shoot it. That's what you want to do. Shoot it.
A little humor at Brad's expense. Look at that rock. Look at that rock there. Now, how do you see most people that walk up? In fact, I would say probably something on the order of 999 out of every 1,000 people that hike up this trail will walk by that rock and not have the slightest clue or second thought as to how that rock got there. But from what you've seen, you look at that, what would you conclude about a rock like that laying in a stream bed in the woods?
One of two things, either rock or ice.
Right. But why not? Why wouldn't it be ice? A glacial erratic is very distinct from a water erratic. A water erratic is rounded. Glacial erratics get crushed and broken. So they don't turn out round. If a glacial erratic will usually have broken edges, it'll have scratches all over it and be ground down. And a glacial erratic looks very distinct from a water erratic. Now here you can see, you'll notice the disparity. What's the disparity here? The disparity is the present day creek and those boulders that are laying in the creek. Now when you have a modern day flood in this watershed, what gets moved is this stuff here, not this. So what kind of a flood emplaced this? A big one that was bigger than the flood in Nelson County, Virginia of 1969. And so the thing you have to appreciate is that there's essentially nowhere in non-glaciated North America where if you know how to recognize it, that you can't see the evidence of gigantic megafloods. In fact, this house is probably sitting on a megaflood deposit. In fact, there's evidence that most of the clay deposits in Georgia underwent major movement at the end of the last ice age. This right here is a picture taken in an arroyo, which is, you find them all over the Southwest. Okay, now this is an arroyo. They're all over the desert floor in the Southwest. And most of them are within 100 to 150 years old. And the reason for that is because they are the consequence of two things. A climate change. There was a period during the medieval warm period where there was more rainfall in the Southwest. More rainfall meant more plants. More plants meant more stable landscapes. Then there was a period of protracted droughts that occurred over the last 300 to 400 years. Okay, the droughts caused a contraction of the plant cover that stabilizes the landscape. The next thing that happened was from about 1850 on, there was extensive cattle grazing. The cattle grazed off a lot of the plant cover. Now, rain comes not in steady showers, but in these events that cause flash floods. The plant cover that stabilizes the landscape has been compromised. The floods can now start eroding. And this is what happens here. There's an arroyo in Chaco Canyon. If you remember the channel that we saw down in the floor of Chaco Canyon is only about 150 years old. But what this does is it cuts in and it reveals the composition of the desert floor. And what is most interesting about it is when you begin to examine the composition of the desert floor, you see that the entire thing was emplaced as a water. It's all water emplaced. This, what you're looking at here, and I'm sorry I don't have a better, clearer image of it, but it's enough, I think, if you look close. What you're seeing is the dried out deposit that was essentially emplaced as a mud flow, a gigantic mud flow. And you can go all over the southwestern United States, and anywhere where there has been an excavation into the desert floor, you're going to see the same thing. You're going to see that you're walking upon what is now a hard, dry, baked material that was emplaced by water. All over. We're talking thousands and thousands of square miles. We have tracked desert floors from Southern California to New Mexico, and they all reveal the same process, the same phenomena. And on this last trip that we did, one of the places we went was Valles Caldera. It was mine and Brad's second time back there. And what I missed the first time was how it was a major piece of evidence. Valles Caldera, right there, is the largest volcanic caldera in North America. And this shows its formation by a subterranean magma reservoir building up pressure at about 1.25 million years ago. The pressure causes multiple ring fractures, and then they extrude catastrophic eruptions. Then you have emptying of the magma chamber and the collapse forming a crater. Then you have a refilling and a resurgent dome, and the last thing that happened was it filled with water. Okay, now I didn't understand the connection, but I just showed you a river, the Jemez River, with Brad standing on a big round rock. I had seen that. That picture was, we first saw those round rocks whenever that was. 04. So 4 years ago, we saw those. I didn't know the source of those floods. This trip going back, I clearly saw the source of the floods. And the floods that moved those round rocks was related to the temporary lake that formed in Valles Caldera. And there you can see it very clearly. The volcano, the collapse, the central uplift. It has a morphology very similar to an impact crater, except that here now the pressures are coming up from underneath. And one way we distinguish a volcanic crater from an impact crater is that the pressures in a volcanic crater never approach the extreme pressures that you find preserved in the rocks of an impact event. Only because as the pressure comes up from below, before it can ever reach pressures close to what are imposed by an impact, the rocks, overlying rocks, give way and the pressure is released. But this was a massive subterranean explosion that would have caused major havoc over the southwest at the time it happened. Well, anyways, I want you to look at the southwestern corner right here. See this outflow channel right there? Okay, here's what happened. Around 12,000 years ago, the crater filled up with water, and it overflowed right here, and it cut a canyon, which is now called, there you can see it pretty clearly. San Diego Canyon. And there were two major flow inputs to this canyon. One came through here, one came through right here. And they carved down and they flowed out here, and then they spread out onto the desert floor. You can go through this canyon, and right here at the confluence of those two streams, which is on this map, is right here, we find a formation called, you can't read it, but it says Battleship Rock. Now, when you say battleship, what is, battleship? It's like when up in the Channel Scablands, you find Steamboat Rock, right? A lot of steamboat rocks. This is Battleship Rock. Why a battleship? Bigger. Well, what? Why a ship? Well, because the rock is eroded into a geometry that's similar to the prow of a ship. Well, why is a prow of a ship shaped like it is? Because a ship or a boat is designed to move with minimal friction through the water.
Or it could be sitting there and the rock rolling into it.
Well, the converse of that is that flowing water erodes things into hydrodynamic geometries. In other words, the erosion of the water passing over any material is going to attempt to erode it into a hydrodynamic shape. Because it starts out with maximum friction, and as it erodes, it becomes less and less friction until finally you get the minimum amount of friction, which will be the shape of a boat hull. That's why a drumlin has that shape, okay? Well, then when you look at Battleship Rock, which is right here at the flow convergence, this is showing the blue arrows show the direction of water flows out of the caldera. And when you look at the material flanking the walls of the canyon, you can see it looks like this. A lot of broken rock, all jumbled up together. This is what it looks like. Okay, now one of the things you can learn how to do is by looking at the degree of angularity as opposed to roundness. That's an indication of how far that rock got removed from its source. Rocks that got moved farther ended up a lot rounder. In fact, what you're seeing up here is at the mouth of the breach point on the caldera. Those big round rocks were down on the valley floor, probably 10 miles down. So the round rocks got transported much further, and they don't have this kind of angularity. And this kind of angularity is a lot closer, Sam, to what you would see with glacial erratics. And then you have finer material like this, but it's all water-laden. Now see, every day thousands of people will drive by this road cut, and the story that it tells they'll just be completely oblivious to it. In fact, the vast majority of the Earth's population is completely oblivious to the fact that we have living in a civilization built on the top of the wreckage of a former world. And that in the most literal sense. We have created a new world on top of the wreckage of a former world that no longer exists. There's Battleship Rock. See, this is where these two major flows came together. One came down this valley, and then one came down this way. And then they joined and cut this massive San Diego Canyon. Well, at this point, the geologists have not yet put the two and two together. They don't realize that this flood is directly connected with the flood that created the Channel Scablands many hundreds of miles north up here in Washington State. I mean, there's a few geologists that have studied this. In fact, the work that showed that there was a major flood out of this caldera hadn't been done when we were there 4 years ago. So that's something that's happened just in the last 4 years. The dating they gave, do you remember the dating they gave at the center? I think it was between 11 and 12,000 years ago, which is of course, very close to the key date that we were looking at there, like at the Clovis site. Because do you remember the date on the Clovis site? 12 to 13,000 years ago. So one of the places we visited was the Clovis site, which is where evidence, and I keep meaning to show you some of those slides. It was extremely interesting because they had displayed bone beds. And you could see the bones laying on one level, and these were the bones of the extinct animals. And then there's about a 6-inch thick layer of this black, dark, they call it the carbonaceous earth, or a layer that's full of silt. And then above there is another bone bed, and the second bone bed is animals, extant animals, animals that still exist. And what was in that carbonaceous earth that separated the old world from the present world? Well, basically cosmic materials. And that's what makes it so damn significant, is because the clues are beginning to show up. The circumstantial evidence has been here for decades. But for one thing, there was a huge prejudice against even considering that there could have been a global catastrophe that recently in geological history. It's one thing to say, yeah, there was a global catastrophe that took down the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, or that took down the trilobites 245 million years ago. But it's a whole different ballgame if you say, oh, there was a global catastrophe a mere 12,000 years ago that would have occurred well during the time that human beings were on the earth. Because if you accept that, then you have to accept that that global catastrophe is a part of our history. And there has been a great reluctance to go there. A great reluctance.
Does anybody mine the cosmic stuff?
Pardon me?
Does anybody mine that cosmic layer?
Mind it?
Mining.
No, it's too diffuse. I mean, we're talking about, 100 parts per billion, like for example of iridium. We're talking about iridium that's like 10 to 100 times above the background count. What are we looking at here? Well, this is volcanic tufa. This is from another one. One of the great volcanic eruptions of North America built these hills that we're standing on here. And this stuff here is called volcanic tufa. It's the Chiricahua Mountains down in southeastern Arizona. This is where the Apache Indians took refuge during the Indian Wars and where Cochise waged war on the U.S. Army. But what's interesting about this is you see massive water erosion on this particularly unique type of rock, called this volcanic rock called tufa. And out here is the remnant of an ancient lake bed that formed when the rains fell on the Chiricahua Mountains. And so here we have the erosion, and down here in the valley we have hundreds of feet of sediment that was once on this mountain that was washed off. And when did this happen? Well, this was the lacustrine sequence. This means lake. Of Lake Cochise. Lake Cochise was the lake that filled this valley temporarily. Okay, here's what they're saying. It provides independent confirmation that 2 periods of pluvial climate. Who remembers what the word pluvial means? Pluvial, what is it? Rainfall, right? Pluvial means rainfall. They studied this and they saw that there was actually evidence of 2 great rainfalls that created this extinct lake. Well, do you remember? I know you do, Jerry. I know you probably would, Paul. Do you remember how many times have I shown you the graph of the sea level rise at the end of the last ice age? How many spikes were there, Jerry? There were 2. 2 massive spikes. What do those 2 spikes represent? They represent the melting of the great ice complexes over North America and Europe, back to the ocean. There's many independent lines of evidence that suggest that coming out of the Ice Age, there was like a 1-2 punch, a 2-fisted transition out of the Ice Age. One at 12,900 years ago and one at 11,500 years ago. And it actually took 2 events to get the planet out of the Ice Age. Because once a planet gets into an Ice Age, there's no reason why a planet should come out of an Ice Age, because there are feedback effects that go into operation once you get into an ice age. Because once the ice begins to form, it alters the albedo. And what is albedo? What is the albedo? When we talk about albedo, what are we talking about? The reflectivity, yes. So high albedo means it's reflecting a lot. Low albedo means it's not reflecting. Light colors reflect, dark colors absorb. Everybody knows that from common experience.
Somebody should tell Al Gore.
Yeah. Well, so what happens is when you get a large area that's covered with snowfall, and in this case we're talking about ice, we're talking 7 or 8 or more million square miles of the Earth's surface, has suddenly got a completely altered albedo, and all of the heat that's falling on this white glacial mass is being reflected into space, and that should further cool the planet. And that further cooling of the planet should cause further expansion of the glaciers. And that further expansion of the glaciers should then in turn cause further cooling. And all the glaciologists who've studied it have confronted that conundrum and said, yeah, it's weird, we don't know. What is it that gets us out of an ice age? That has been the problem for 150 years since the whole concept of an ice age was first proposed. Was, okay, fine, but once we get into an ice age, how the hell do you get out of it? Well, 12,000 years ago, we were as deep, this planet was deep into an ice age. I mean, think about it. You go up to where the Great Lakes are now, and you had perhaps a mile thick of ice. You know, you go up to New York State, thousands of feet of ice. Here in Georgia, what was Georgia like? Well, you know, we had northern forests. If you want to find out what Georgia was like, go hiking up in Ontario. That's what Georgia was like. I mean, there was a very stable regime of climate on the planet that had existed for at least 10,000 or 15,000 years or longer. And at 12,000 years ago, roughly, suddenly the planet lurched out of this one equilibrium state, went through a period of a couple of thousand years of total chaos, and then settled out into the equilibrium that it is now, which is, of course, not, we call this an interglacial. And as a consequence of going from glacial to interglacial, worldwide sea levels came up 400 feet. And I would like to remind Al Gore about that when he's talking about 1 to 2 feet over the next century. Well, you remember at the end of the last ice age, the sea levels came up 400 feet. What would a sea level change of 400 feet mean for modern society? Let's say we went back into an ice age, totally discounting all of the repercussions of the change of climate. What would a 400-foot change in sea level mean?
Beach.
What? Beach. Well, you could buy beachfront property, but in a very short while, you'd be landlocked.
Okay, question.
Yes.
Going off on a rabbit trail, where's the Grail story?
Right here. See what's the title of this book?
Change the screen there.
Catastrophe. Catastrophe. And that is a major component of the whole Grail story. is that there was a catastrophe that came over England. And in order to decipher that, we have to know about catastrophe in all of its...
Now how they fixed it. How they fixed it.
Yeah.
They came back with the Grail and everything was fine again. So
what did they do? Well, isn't that the mystery? Okay, well here's where we were kind of leaving off. Remember this now? Is it coming back to you? So this is what we got into 2 weeks ago. And there's a reason why we got into this, because, okay, a couple of things here. There's a catastrophe. There's a huge catastrophe 12,000 years ago. Then there's another catastrophe 5,000 years ago. What happened 5,000 years ago? Burckle Crater. Yeah, something fell into the Indian Ocean, plowed its way through 2 miles of ocean water and gouged a hole 12 miles wide in the bottom of the Indian Ocean. And this would have created tsunamis that were a minimum of 600 feet in height. Now what's interesting is the dating, the radiocarbon dating on the material in the tsunami deposits puts it precisely with the biblical chronology for Noah's flood, which you've seen me actually revise my perspective, because I believed that all the stories about the floods all were rooted in the end of the Ice Age. Now, since I learned about Burckle Crater, I've become convinced that Plato meant exactly what he said when he reported that the Egyptian priests were belittling the Greeks, because the Greeks only knew about the last flood and the Egyptians knew about at least 3 of them. And the one of Noah and Deucalion was only the most recent. Well, as it turns out, once again, that's totally consistent with the scientific evidence, that there have been these multiple catastrophes. And up until 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, it was believed that the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, had been stable, and that there had been no... Yeah, there was guys who acknowledged, hey, there was apparently a climate catastrophe coming out of the Ice Age, and it might have been responsible for the elimination of all the megamammals, but it's been nice and stable since then. Well, the illusion of stability of the Holocene has pretty much disappeared in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, and really within the last 2 years with the discovery of the giant crater off of the coast of New Zealand and the big crater off the coast of Madagascar, which shows that there have been repeated cosmic events throughout the Holocene as well. Well, if an object a mile wide fell into the ocean, what kind of consequences would that have for modern society? If something came out of the cosmic deep and fell into the ocean, moving at, say, 20,000 miles per hour, what consequences would it have for modern society? Well, it wouldn't cause the extermination of the human race. However, what it would cause is that 5,000 years from now, the descendants of the survivors of that event would be looking at 100 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, being the beginning of history. And we see that the beginning of recorded history is dated at 4,800 to 5,000 years ago with the invention of cuneiform writing. And so we say, well, that's when the record began, and before that there was no real history. It was the Mesolithic, and before that was the Paleolithic. So what I'm getting at, hang on, Don, I'll get, because I don't want to deviate too far afield. What I'm saying is here, to understand the whole business of this Holy Grail, it has to be placed within this context of catastrophe. Because the Holy Grail perhaps represents one of the means by which stability is returned to nature after a catastrophe. So when you look at the dating of the early megalithic structures, when do they appear? You know, the earliest Stonehenge, the earliest earthworks in North America, the earliest works that we see in South America. We can go all over the planet, and we see that roughly 4,500 to 4,800 years ago was when we see the first examples. You know, the Old Kingdom in Egypt, when is that? 48, 40, 45, 46, 4,700 years ago. You know, when is the first phase of Stonehenge? You know, 45, 4,600 years ago. So what we're seeing here is in the aftermath of a catastrophe. What's the first thing, possibly, that we see people doing? Well, we see them setting up gigantic stones, building pyramids, building temples. All over the British Isles, in the next 500 years, there were thousands of giant stones set up. Well, I don't think that most researchers have not placed these events within the context of these unfolding cosmic catastrophes and what they may do to the balance of terrestrial nature. And it's only, I think, in that context that you can begin to understand what they were attempting to do. And what they were attempting to do was to bring about a realignment of the natural balances that had been disrupted during these catastrophic events. And the Holy Grail was one way of symbolizing the technological means by which they did this. So you cannot even discuss the Holy Grail meaningfully by taking it out of the context of this whole unfolding series of cosmic events that our planet has been a part of. That's what I'm trying to get at here. The more we understand the catastrophes, the more we're going to understand the technologies that were the response to those catastrophes. The more that we understand what happened to nature and how nature was dislodged from its normal harmonies, only then are we going to be able to understand what the efforts were and what the strategies were for restoring that balance. That's what I'm getting at here. We cannot understand these catastrophes too little, because it's going to be the central issue of our lives, if not our lives, our children's lives, or our grandchildren's for sure. But catastrophe lies in our future. Of that there is no question whatsoever, because the laws of physics have not been changed. It's still the same cosmic environment that our ancestors had to face. When they set up those stones, when they built those temples so that they could track celestial motion with a great degree of precision, they were thinking about the future. They were thinking about us. And so we can't just ignore and neglect the fact that these catastrophes have been an ongoing part of the whole story, and that everything that's going on now is a response to that.